Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here, and welcome to everybody joining us today on this Inclusive Learning Environment webinar. And I'm really looking forward to our discussions today, which will hopefully be illuminating and will provoke reflection and conversation. Now, firstly, just to say that if you do have any questions, there should be a Q&A chat box there that you can pop your questions in, and I will endeavour to pick them up at the end of the talks that we have today. And today we do have two experts who are joining me. We're having a little problem at the moment with one of them, with Anne. She's having a few technical problems, so hopefully she'll be joining us in a little while. Just by way of introductions then, my name is Sarah Williams. I'm an architect and I'm an RIBA client advisor, and somebody who spent a large part of my career designing, building and advising on educational design. I currently chair the RIBA steering group of client advisors. I've spent time with the Department of Education advising, design advising there, and lots of projects across lots of different sectors. So if you do want to find out more about what we do as client advisors, then do get in touch, go and visit the RIBA website. We'll be able to get a lot more information there. And joining me today, we have Anne Griffin, who hopefully, as I say, will be joining us in a little while when she gets her tech sorted. Who's also a client advisor and chartered architect and a community-led homes advisor. She founded Architects Collaborative in 2016, consultancy which provides independent strategic advice, and has developed her expertise in social infrastructure projects, urban design and master planning. And I know that she's delivered and advised on many schools. So hopefully we'll be seeing Anna shortly. And also joining me today is Jean Hewitt, who is a senior inclusive design consultant and trainer with Borough Happold. Jean specialised in access and inclusion for 20 years after having done her postgrad studies in inclusive design and management. And alongside her role at Borough Happold, Jean is also honorary senior lecturer at UCL, delivering the Designing Inclusive Places module within the MSc Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings programme. She's also a long-standing member of BSI's Committee for the Design of an Accessible and Inclusive Environment, and is currently technical author for the new BSI PAS that she's going to be talking about today, Design for the Mind, Neurodiversity and the Built Environment. So I think today's talks, we're going to be looking at that issue of how we can support inclusivity fully within the built environment. How do we design for this? What is well-being, and how does that begin to overlap with what we're talking about in terms of inclusivity? It's important, obviously, the awareness about how we deal with the fact that the environment has the potential to cause sensory overload, anxiety and distress, and really what do we need to be doing as all of us involved, or many of us involved at least, in the built environment work? How do we begin to deal with that? So there's obviously an opportunity to explore the kind of broader definition of inclusion and how inclusive design overlaps with ensuring well-being for all. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to hand it over to Jean, who's going to kick off for us today. Learning environments for mental well-being and neurodiversity. So welcome, Jean. And hopefully you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hello and good afternoon. So I'll just share my slides. Bear with me 1 second. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, I can see that, Jean.
Fantastic. Okay, so I can't see chat or anything like that. So if you can let me know, Sarah, if you need to interrupt me at any point.
I will.
So that's me, and I'll pitch straight in with the principles of inclusive design. So inclusive design places people at the heart of the design process. It acknowledges that we are all different. We have human diversity. We need environments that offer dignity, autonomy, choice and spontaneity, of course, and provide for flexibility in use by different people at different times and for different types of people. To provide environments and buildings that are convenient and enjoyable for everyone to use. And there's nothing within those 5 principles that says that's about physical accessibility. And in fact, it's not. It's about every aspect of the built environment that we could be looking at. My initial interest in looking at neurodiversity and the built environment was in 2009, where the Equality Challenge Unit asked me to look at a number of different sites to compare them for sensory access. And my question was really, well, what do you mean by sensory access? Do you mean sight and hearing? Because that's normally what people would ask me to look for. But actually they were saying, no, we actually want you to go a step further and look at autism as well. And at that point, there was very little guidance out there on exactly what I should be doing. So we had as stakeholders within that process, the Autism Society and other players, and they were able to work with me to develop what an appropriate checklist might be. And then in 2016, the BSI commissioned some research with the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design entitled Design for the Mind. Now, within the BSI role that I have on one of the committees for accessibility and inclusion, we often talk about we're not doing enough around sensory access for everybody and different brain types and so on. So what this guidance was looking at, they had lots of interviewees and they were going out to interview people about how they felt about the built environment. And the people they interviewed were by and large people who were not neurotypical. So they had some sensory differences in how they experienced the built environment. So they may have had dementia, or autism, ADHD, and a number of other conditions. So following that, sorry, I have a very noisy cat in the background. This happens on all calls, I'm afraid. So following that research, there was then the thought that BSI would develop some firm guidance and technical guidance around that. And that's really where I'm working at the moment. So we have a first draft that's with the steering group at the moment. It's called Design for the Mind, Neurodiversity in the Built and the Built Environment. So the name needs correcting. And it's a guidance document, but we've tried to go into more detail. So connecting up some of the comments that came in that very important and very useful 2016 guidance by Helen Hamlin for BSI, which had a lot of interviews with people and people saying what it was about the built environment that troubled them. Taking that content and trying to develop some technical standards from it. At the same time, around 2018, I was commissioned to undertake a project for BBC, and they were looking at a new headquarters building, so nothing to do with education, but they knew that a lot of their staff were neurodivergent and were experiencing difficulties in some of their buildings. So they were very proactive and positive about trying to do something about this, and this is just a little bit of the coverage that it experienced at the time in 2019. So moving forward, a bit of explanation about neurodiversity for those of you who don't already have come across that term, or maybe have a different understanding of what that term means than the way we are using it in the standard. So basically what we're saying is neurodiversity is everyone. Human beings don't come in a one-size-fits-all neurologically. So the majority, probably 70% of the population, are what we call neurotypical. But there will be lots of natural and normal genetic variations to that. So we're all different. We all think and process information differently. We learn new things in a different way. We communicate slightly differently to one another. It would be boring if we were all the same, wouldn't it? We find our way from A to B differently, and we experience the world a little bit differently. So if you look at that little snapshot of a diagram in the top right-hand corner, you can see a line running through it. And that line with a little bit of variation, I don't know if you can see that slight purple dipping on there as well. That's typically what a neurotypical person's cognitive profile might look like. Fairly evenly, across the spectrum of our different abilities. When someone has a spiky profile, it means they can be exceptionally good at one thing and then perhaps much weaker on another, and you get this sort of zigzagging. That's really what we're talking about when we say someone is not neurotypical and they have more of a neurodivergent profile. So not fitting that majority neurotypical model. And then of course there are some people who are not born with a neurodivergent condition, but they become neurodivergent through a neurodegenerative process, usually a progressive condition such as dementia. So we've got a bit of a mix there. But that's how I'm using the terms, and that's how they're used in the standard. And I do know that some groups are taking neurodiversity as being neurodivergent, but we're using it in its truest sense that neurodiversity is everyone. And there's a list here of some of the types of conditions that might be considered neurodivergent, but we don't want to be talking about lists and names and labels within the standard. What we want to say really is, look, we're all messy and we're all neurodiverse in some, in some way we have little spikes. I mean, I, for example, generally neurotypical, but I have a spike around wayfinding. My wayfinding is atrocious. I have no compass. So should we be putting people in boxes, or should we just try and fix this with the environment and the way we treat people? So the challenge to date has been that the understanding of neurominority conditions hasn't been good enough to develop some of the design guidance. And I'm sure when Anne talks later, she will come up lots of wonderful nuggets of things she's learnt along the way. But much of it isn't documented in technical standards, I'm afraid. Our understanding, of course, is growing rapidly, and in particular, there's a lot of guidance around dementia care and autism, which is already published. But we have much more limited guidance on mainstream buildings and how we could design to meet everyone's needs within those, so we can have a very a deeper care setting, possibly an SEN school or a dementia care home are examples of that. But in mainstream education and other buildings, we haven't got that balance right yet. And the complexity, of course, of individual needs can conflict. And one of the barriers for design has been, and one of them has said to me, look, everybody says if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So how can we possibly design for such a spectrum of difference? Well, I think we can. And I think what we need is a holistic approach to it. And we need to take out of the environment the things that upset and are the biggest barriers, really, in the same way as we would for wheelchair access, to be honest, so that we can get to a nice level playing field for everyone in how we use spaces. And of course, this holistic approach is not just the design of the building, it's also how it's managed, it's about the training of the staff, it's about the technology you put in there and the information, and it's also how you find your way there in the first place. So developing the PAS, it's a first step towards a formal standard. A PAS is something that is a publicly available specification. Basically, it's a very quick document to produce. It has a technical author, which I'm blessed with being given that opportunity to be the technical author. That doesn't mean I'm the biggest expert on this in the UK, I'm certainly not. What it means is that I'm going to write the standard with the help of a really expert steering group and a wider review panel. So the development of any PAS is always sponsored, and in this case we have some very interesting sponsors. So Transport for London are the lead sponsor, and it's obvious that transport environments is something they very much hope to improve through the standard, and they have a number of initiatives running. BBC Workplace are also another sponsor, and obviously they've been trying to be pioneering in this area within the workplace. Forbo Flooring, again, flooring is one of the biggest finishes that any of us encounter. So there are a lot of opportunities that if we can get that right, that will improve the experience for a lot of people. And then Bura Happold are sponsoring, so we're a multidisciplinary organisation, and they're sponsoring my involvement in this PAS, which I'm absolutely delighted about. So this is the title. So it's founded on that Helen Hamlin research, but I have to then extract that and pull it into something that narrows it down. So the Helen Hamlin research would say that a lot of people found certain things too bright, too noisy, etc. And how do I transition that into a technical guidance paragraph that is meaningful to designers? So we're trying to give guidance reflecting those findings. We're also trying to signpost to other standards and to guidance that's already out there, like dementia care, like designing for autism. And it's also influenced in a way by recent research. So there's pockets of research everywhere, and some of which is done by some of my students in UCL. Because of my interest with it, it sparked some ideas there, so that's been really useful as well. So the scope of this is buildings and environments for mainstream public use. Now, we fully recognise that there is a need for some other types of buildings, but this is the first step, it's the starting place. And the purpose is to put something out there that can be evaluated in use by designers. It's voluntary, nobody has to follow it, but by voluntarily following it, we can test some of the assumptions and the guidance that has been written in. So it's an evaluation process, typically lasting around 2 years. Most PAS documents only have a 2-year shelf life. And this particular one, we are hoping, will probably go into one of the BS 8300 series if it gets adopted, or if parts of it get adopted. It may not be adopted in its entirety, of course. And the BS 8300 is the Bible really around inclusive design and accessibility. The standard will cover this design and management. Now we haven't put management in the title, but we haven't got management in the title of the BS 8300 series either, and it does cover it. Our target audiences, as always, will be architects, planners, building managers, any decision makers about the built environment. It will cover all building types, but notably the deeper care provision that you might find in a specialist school or in a dementia care home or deeper care setting is not specifically covered in the PAS. However, we do hope that some of the guidance in there might be helpful to the more general areas, so corridors and receptions and stuff in those types of buildings. Key considerations were sensory overload, so this visual and audible noise that people can experience in a very intrusive way. Lighting was another item that came up, and also layout, so simple, logical, clear sightlines. And I'm sure when we listen to Anne that some of these themes will come up again and again in the issues that cause people problems. Familiarity was thought to be very important in the interviews that Helen Hamlin undertook. That if something fits an already understood model in design terms, then it becomes easier. And an opportunity to preview, so being able to see a building before we go into it, having something explained to us, maybe having something on a website even. If you imagine your first day at university or school, that anxiety that goes with that, if you could go onto a website and you could do a tour of the school, anything that you can do to inform you before you get there is helpful to all of us when we're nervous. But if you are someone who experiences sensory overload, it's even more important to be able to do that. Now, the standard is not just about the typical neurodivergent. Can I use those two terms together? I'm not sure I can, but it's not just about people who experience sort of ADHD, autism, dementia, the things that we more commonly think of as neurodivergent. We've realised that there are a number of other conditions that also benefit from some of this guidance. For example, many migraine sufferers and people with vestibular balance conditions like Meniere's can be adversely affected by patterns and lighting in the same way as someone might be with autism. So in terms of sensory difference then, generally there's two types. So hypersensitivity, so extreme overload would be experienced with that, and that is the majority of people with autism will experience that. But there are also lots of other people who haven't got autism that would experience that as well. And the other opposite of that would be hyposensitivity, where you feel understimulated by an environment and you would seek additional sensory stimulation. Now the latter, the bottom one there, the hyposensitivity, isn't something we're covering in a great deal in the standard, because we feel that people can add that themselves. There are gadgets and tools and ways of adding that yourself to an environment or to where you are and how you feel. Whereas when someone is hypersensitive, it's really difficult to control the situation when the actual environment itself is causing that. So we're looking at sounds and visuals and smells and tactile and touch. These were the key strands that came out from the Helen Hamlin report. So these are the key ones that we are looking at. But what we've done is transition those into the headings that we would have in a BS 8300 standard, so that when the time comes to go across into the standard, it should make life easier. So that's why the structure is going to be what it is. In addition to those elements, I would say we are looking at external and internal, because we recognised that people have to move through the external environment in order to reach the internal, and part of that is wayfinding as well, which is a huge issue for many people within this and beyond. And there were quite a few MEP items, so that's mechanical, electrical, power items. So such as odours and smells, VOCs, off-gassing from carpets and floor, things like that, air quality, and the controlling of the environment was found to be really, really important. Quiet and restorative spaces. So we can't make every environment completely calm and bland and calming, and quiet and so on. So where we can't do that, the key is to provide a quiet and restorative space where someone can go to calm down, to reset, to recharge. And we're all seeing those going into workspaces and other buildings such as stadia and theatres and things. So really, really important, especially important in a learning space, to have that, because when you are trying to get your head down and study and learn, that's when this makes a much bigger impact. I think if you think about yourselves in perhaps an exam situation, you will know when you're really tense and you're trying really hard to focus that a whirring fan will be much more intrusive than it would be on a day-to-day basis for you. Imagine feeling like that all the time and never being able to study or work well because of lots of extraneous noises. It's just an example, but there's much more to it than that. We've also included a little bit about additional considerations for evacuation. Things like, fire alarm bells going off, incredibly noisy. And lots of things about stakeholder engagement, because although lots of designers do very successful stakeholder engagement, quite often missing from that table of consultees will be someone who doesn't like to be in a group and doesn't want to give feedback in that way. So it's about finding another way to reach out to people with some of those sensory differences. And just to give you an example, we found that some patterns can be disturbing. Some of you, if you're looking at your screen, depending on what size screen you're looking at and what your lighting is doing, might find some of these are actually moving a little bit. Certainly not the sort of patterns you'd like to have, some of those stripes with migraine, if you're a regular migraine sufferer. And there are other patterns where we think, oh, that's, nicer. Generally, those patterns are the more natural ones, the ones that occur in nature, and they're not straight lines, of course. So they're fractal patterns and so on. And we know that the connectivity with nature is really, really helpful to people as well. In terms of mental health, just because you have a neurodivergent condition doesn't mean that you have mental ill health. However, if day to day you are bombarded with the senses and you experience sensory overload every day, then it's quite clear that your mental health will not be as well as somebody who doesn't experience that. So our neuro profile can be a significant factor for our mental well-being. And if we make attention to that sensory impact of spaces, I think we can eliminate a lot of key features which are causing sensory overload at the current time. So the quiet and restorative spaces can help because they help you to recover. And I do think biophilic design is a really good way of bringing in calming materials that we can touch. So we know that we can feel better after touching things like timbers and granites and stones and that. So biophilic design would fit nicely into this to help everybody to flourish and at least not become mentally ill from their environment. So I think there's lots we can do there, even views to the outside and bringing nature inside a bit as well, even with pictures, can be truly, truly helpful. So I've been in inclusive design for over 20 years, and I know for several decades now we've tried to capture every possible anthropometric piece of data, reach distances, seated heights, door widths, we want level access, etc., etc., etc. And we've also catered a little bit for sight loss in terms of colour contrast and hearing impairments as well with our acoustics and our assistive technology. But I think we're only now just beginning to recognise the importance of an environment for our mental well-being and our capacity for thought, emotion, behaviour and learning. So none of us can operate in isolation from our environment, physically, mentally or emotionally. If you wanted a really beautiful garden, you would want a variety of flowers in it. Some of those flowers will need different amounts of water. They will need slightly different environments. They will need slightly different plant feeds. Some will want to be in the shade and some will want to be in strong sunshine. We understand that about gardens. It's very well understood. We just need to understand it about humans as well. So we're all different. and we do have this connection with nature and with our environments. And I think we just need to be going that step further. So this PAS is really a first step. It's the first toe in the water, if you like, to seeing what we can do with standards to try and make places better. I'm just going to finish very quickly to say, which is very topical, I think, at the moment. We're all living through this COVID pandemic, and just to mention a flex standard. So I was involved with this last year. And basically a flex standard by BSI is one that changes very quickly. And you can see here that we had the version 1, the second version was by July last year, then the third by August. And what's happened now, it's been rolled into an ISO. So it's an international standard now. What happened with the first one that came out was people with disabilities were actually overlooked. So there were some complaints. I'm sure BSI won't mind me saying that because they captured it very quickly and they moved very swiftly on this. And myself and Pip Jackson from UCL, we gave input as to what were the key accessibility and inclusion considerations. And I'll just talk about a couple now. So loads and loads of standards came out, but all of these other standards don't particularly touch on disability or any additional needs in any way. So I think it is an important area that was overlooked. But there were some flawed assumptions made on who was vulnerable to the pandemic. So there were people suggested they could stay at home because they were perhaps a wheelchair user. Actually, if you're blind or partially sighted or a wheelchair user or have hearing aids, there's absolutely no reason why you'd be more vulnerable to COVID at all from any of those. Whereas a hidden disability like diabetes or respiratory condition clearly would place you at more risk. So that was the first thing that was going on, particularly with workplaces. The second thing, which I think everybody has now recognised, was that mental health can be made so much worse by isolation if you haven't got the proper support mechanisms around you. And some people have become much more vulnerable to mental ill health, excuse my typo, during lockdown or extended home study arrangements. So there were some parts of home study which were helpful for some people, and we get that quiet concentration space, but in other ways the isolation was not so good. Another key one for me was around the PEEPs, the personal emergency evacuation plans, which schools and colleges and universities all have, as well as every working environment, which is a way of ensuring that people with additional requirements for evacuation, i.e. they can't go down the stairs independently without any assistance or help, have a plan, a PEEP plan in place. And from what I've heard, very few places were actually reviewing those before they were allowing people back into the workplace. And it could mean their buddies were no longer there, they hadn't got enough people to provide assistance, or the person that was trained to give assistance wasn't there. So that was another gap. Wayfinding communication was very difficult. So temporary directional signs often didn't follow accessibility guidelines. They weren't in accessible print format. There were all sorts of symbols coming out that if you had a learning disability, goodness knows how you would manage. Every supermarket was different, basically. And of course, we had these one-way systems, but actually a lot of tutting around people with mobility impairments. You had to use the lift. That sometimes compromised the one-way system. So there was those sorts of issues going on as well. And of course, a lot of people lost their ability to partially lip read or fully lip read because of the obstruction of the face mask itself, and also that it masked some of the sounds as well. There were a few good things that we liked. So sensor taps will work for everybody without touching, so that's a good thing to keep. And we love to see all of the noisy hand dryers disabled or switched off because they're really intrusive to a lot of people, and people with any sensory impairment, including hearing aid wearers like myself, or anyone who's oversensitive to noise. We're finding those particularly difficult, and we know that the noise emitted from some of these high-speed hand dryers is damaging to young children's ears. So to switch those off and switch to recycled hand towels was still sustainable, but that was really welcomed, as well as lots of apps and technology that makes it easier to react to the COVID situation, but also you can give it an accessible format. It's easier to change. And then the hands-free security systems, such touchpad, proximity pads and things like that, were obviously better in spreading germs as well. So just a quick check on my timing. I won't say too much on this, but obviously automated doors have been a godsend in reopening buildings because we don't have to touch them. But there were a few designs coming out about how you could do it with the elbow and so forth, and we just needed to look at accessibility in terms of that. I think there's a huge opportunity to review the design of learning spaces going forward, and the importance of choice and control, particularly around neurodiversity, is really, really important. So there were some good things about the virtual learning. So with this, I teach MSc students, and the flexibility that they could watch it later because it was recorded is really helpful. However, I know that they've missed that face-to-face interaction, and it can feel lonely as well. Hopefully when we come out of this, it won't go completely back the other way, but we will offer people choice, and they can make that choice without being frowned upon. That not everybody wants to sit in a classroom with others. That some of the older students can sometimes take time out or re-watch a learning session at their own speed as well is really helpful. Some of the software has been great. So we've had automatic subtitling in Teams quite a lot of the time. And you can fix the signer on some of the other software as well, so you can have a BSL signer. And I think that benefit of breakout spaces and quiet restorative spaces has become even more important and very highlighted. And I think that is something that hopefully will appear much more as offices and schools and colleges are redesigned. So just to finish, I think this is my view of access and inclusion. That it covers all of these things, but it covers it in every way, so that it covers it in a mental health, physical access, neurological well-being, and it requires that holistic approach to designing, managing and occupying the built environment, whether it's a school, a shop, or an office, a shopping centre, a stadium, a theatre, wherever it is. So it's a quick whiz through. We'd love to hear from you. You've got any comments on this? I've put in there the BSI link to the first notification of the project launch on the PAS, so you can read a bit more about it there as well. And time-wise, I'm hoping that it will be out by the autumn, but there should be a public consultation copy before that. So I'll just stop sharing my slides. There we are, and hand back to Sarah.
Thank you, Jean. That was great. Now, I've just heard, unfortunately, that Anne has still got technical problems, so she won't be able to join us now. But for those of you watching, they will record something and they will add it into this webinar. So hopefully you'll be able to see her talk once they've recorded it and uploaded it. But Jean, I did have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. Really a reflection on just hearing you, how aligned the whole issue of inclusivity, well-being and sustainability seem to be becoming. And as you say, it's certainly in the last year and various talks I've done, been involved with, the whole issue of mental and physical well-being is really coming to the fore now. And what's interesting is this alignment with what we need to be doing with our buildings in any event to make sure we're achieving all the sustainable outcomes that we know we have to achieve. And there's a real alignment between all of them now that I think we've not really focused on before. But I guess at Borough Happel, you must obviously see quite a lot of that alignment. You talked about biophilic design, the sort of daylight issue of lighting, the issue of ventilation, the issue of acoustics. These are all things that we're looking at in order to achieve really sustainable outcomes for our clients. So it's very interesting how I can see this alignment now with this added issue around, the things you've been talking about today.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the reasons why I was asked if I'd like to be technical author, because I work in a multi-dis environment and, have the opportunities to have those conversations and collaboration on some of these issues. And I've only been at Borough Happel I'm just coming up for 3 years, but I found it hugely beneficial because most inclusive designers are quite often they're one-man bands and self-employed. So it's really beneficial to have other teams I can go and talk to and say, oh, do you know, so VOCs and things like that was one area and acoustics was another and lighting was another. Really interesting to say, I don't think there's anything out there. Can you confirm that? Because I can't possibly be an expert on all these things.
Yeah.
You know, what I'm trying to do is just to bring together the human-centric bit. So I know about people, and get other people to help me with their amazing research and so forth. And we've got a fantastic steering group from all walks of life. So I'm hoping we can end up with, it's quite a concise document, if I'm honest. It's about, I think at the moment it's sitting at 50 pages, whereas I felt really to do it justice you might need 300, but this is the start, and it's important to get something out quite soon, I think.
Yeah, and out of interest, obviously I work with the Department of Education. Are you talking to the the SEND team at the department in order to try and feed some of this into their thinking, into their briefs, if you like?
It's interesting you say that. I think they're probably listed on the review panel. They're not listed on, they're not within the steering group, although we have some people, quite a few people with specialist SEN knowledge on that steering group. It's a fantastic group of experts, but I definitely think they should be. I mean, most government departments would be on the list for the review panel.
Yeah.
Because of the implications across the whole built environment sector, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, I mean, ideally, we're not talking about, obviously some children will be in SEN settings, but there will be a lot with some of these conditions that are actually very capable of being in mainstream, if only we can get the environment a little bit better.
Yeah, well, it's all those sorts of things will be very useful to feed into their briefing tools that they develop. And would you say there's any particular area in the document that you spend more time looking at? Is there any particular topics that take up the bigger chunk of the document, if you like?
Well, I was really blessed. I had a student last year who was interested in autism and the quiet spaces. And she did an amazing international piece of research with lots and lots of people taking part around quiet and restorative spaces. So with her blessing, we've managed to get some of that into the draft standard, and it's the first time I've ever seen some consolidated guidance around how you make a quiet space, because everybody has a different view on it. But for it to be a truly quiet space, it's very different to a sensory room, where there you're trying to stimulate the senses and everything. This is the opposite. I think you can combine the two with clever storage and things, so it could be used for either. But obviously the main environment's got to be designed right in the first place. So that's quite a big section in there, and wayfinding is quite a big section as well. There's a lot to be said about how people find their way around and navigate spaces and journeys and so forth. So yeah, I think those are probably the two bigger areas.
And it's out, when did you say it's out? In the autumn?
We go to steering group week after next. We've had the first draft. I've had their comments back, so we'll have a meeting. We have a meeting about that, and then the next round goes out to review panel, and then after that, I think we'll probably see it in the summer as a public consultation first. It's always difficult with COVID because we have had a little bit of delay because of that. And in fact, at the beginning, they said, oh, and now COVID's happened, so do we just delay? And I said, oh, please don't delay it. Can we? And of course, it's been quite easy, hasn't it, to engage and talk. In fact, probably easier than it would be face to face in some ways to collect all this information. But I've had a mountain of information sent to me. I found some really good books here and abroad. And some of that has influenced it. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's the main thing is that it's the first step, and I hope people grasp it and look at it and challenge it and try apply maybe even a little bit of it just to make places better. That's
great. Well, look, we look forward to reading it when it comes out, and thank you so much. It was really informative. And to everyone listening, apologies again for Anne, but hopefully they will get that out in the catch-up version. So thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you all on the next one. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.